In the year of 1928, young Edward Budd was a lad of 18, full of enterprise and determination. Seeking to escape the grinding poverty of his family, Edward placed a classified advertisement in the Sunday edition of the New York World on May 25th. It read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." He was a strong, eager youth, keen to work and support his family, who were confined to a squalid tenement in the crowded, dirty city. On the Monday following May 28th, Edward's mother, Delia Budd, a formidable woman of substantial build, answered a knock at their door. Standing there was an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, Long Island. He expressed his interest in interviewing young Edward for a position on his farm. Delia instructed her young daughter, 5-year-old Beatrice, to fetch Edward from his friend's apartment. The old man smiled kindly at the child and handed her a nickel for her trouble. As they awaited Edward's return, Delia took the opportunity to observe the old man more closely. His face, framed by grey hair and a large droopy grey moustache, exuded kindness. He regaled Mrs. Budd with tales of his life, explaining he had spent many years as an interior decorator in the city, before retiring to a farm-boat with his savings. He spoke of raising 6 children alone after his wife had abandoned him more than a decade ago. With smiling eyes, he then explained he had been seeking a strong and honest young lad to assist him on the farm. He described how grand a life it was out there, far from the city's grime. Fresh air, honest work, and plenty of space to thrive. Delia saw a glimmer of hope in this encounter. This could be the chance for Edward to break free from the relentless hardships of city life. The old man's demeanor was disarmingly charming, and his story appeared sincere. However, unbeknownst to Delia, this seemingly fortuitous meeting would lead to a harrowing saga that would forever alter the course of the Budd family's lives. With the assistance of his children, 5 farmhands and a Swedish cook, Mr. Howard had transformed his farm into a thriving enterprise, boasting several hundred chickens and a half-dozen dairy cows. Now, with one of his farmhands moving on, he was in need of a replacement. When Edward was introduced to Mr. Howard, the elderly man remarked upon the boy's impressive size and strength, and Edward assured him he was a diligent worker. Mr. Howard offered him $15 a week, which Edward accepted with enthusiasm. To their delight, Mr. Howard even agreed to hire Willie, Edward's closest friend. Mr. Howard mentioned he had an appointment to attend and promised to return on Saturday to pick up the boys. Edward and Willie were elated, and the Budd family rejoiced at the prospect of Edward securing such a favourable position through his modest advertisement. Saturday, June 2nd, was anticipated to be the grand day, but Mr. Howard did not arrive. Instead, they received a handwritten note from him, explaining he had been delayed and would call the next morning. The following morning, around 11, Frank Howard finally arrived at the Budds' apartment. He brought gifts of strawberries and fresh, creamy pot cheese, proudly explaining all of the products had come from his very own farm where the boys would be working. Delia persuaded the old man to stay for lunch. For the first time, Albert Budd Sr. had the opportunity to converse with his son's new employer. The discussion filled him with pride and satisfaction. The kindly, polite old gentleman rhapsodized about his 20 acres of farmland, his amiable crew of farmhands, and the simple, hearty country life. It was precisely the life that Albert knew his son desired. Howard assured the boy's father that it would be his pleasure to share his little piece of heaven with them all, and went on to paint the scene of the countryside, the fresh air, the honest toil, and the satisfaction of seeing the fruits of one's labor. The Budd family, comforted by Mr. Howard's genuine demeanor and promise of a better future, felt an overwhelming sense of relief and hope. However, this newfound hope would soon be overshadowed by an unforeseen darkness that loomed ahead. Albert Budd Sr. was a porter for the Equitable Life Assurance Company, a man who carried an air of perpetual submissiveness. Though he was not particularly impressed with Frank Howard's appearance in his rumpled blue suit, the old man exuded credibility and genteel manners. As they sat down to lunch, the door opened and a lovely 10-year-old girl appeared. Gracie was humming her song, her large brown eyes and dark brown hair contrasting beautifully with the very pale skin and pink lips. She would surely be a heartbreaker someday. Coming straight from church, Gracie still wore her Sunday best. A white silk confirmation dress, white silk stockings, and a string of creamy pearls that made her look older than her 10 years. Frank Howard, like most men who came face to face with the radiant Gracie, couldn't take his eyes off the beautiful girl. "Let's see how good a counter you are," he said, handing her a large wad of bills to count. The impoverished Budds were astounded by the amount of money the old man was carrying. $92.50, Gracie announced promptly. Mr. Howard remarked how bright she was and gave her 50 cents to buy candy for herself and her little sister Beatrice. Howard mentioned he would return later in the evening to collect Edward and Willie, but first, he needed to attend a birthday party his sister was hosting for one of her children. He generously gave the boys $2 to go to the movies. Such was the charm and generosity of Frank Howard, leaving the Budd family in awe and hopeful for a better future. But as the hours passed, the anticipation of his return would soon be overshadowed by a sense of foreboding that none could foresee. Just as he was about to leave, Mr. Howard extended an invitation to Gracie, asking her to accompany him to his niece's birthday party. He assured Delia that he would take good care of Gracie and have her home before 9 o'clock that evening. Delia inquired about the location of Mr. Howard's sister, and he responded that she lived in an apartment house at Columbus and 137th Street. Although Delia had her reservations about letting Gracie go, Albert Sr. persuaded her, saying, "Let the poor kid go. She doesn't see much good times." So Delia helped Gracie into her good coat and her grey hat with the streamers. She watched as Gracie and Mr. Howard walked down the street, disappearing from view. That evening, there was no word from Mr. Howard and no sign of Gracie. The family endured a terrible, sleepless night, filled with anxiety and dread. The next morning, young Edward was dispatched to the police station to report his sister's disappearance. The Budd family's joy had turned to despair as they faced the horrifying reality of Gracie's disappearance. What was meant to be a joyous outing had become a nightmare, with no trace of their beautiful daughter anywhere. The unfolding events would soon reveal a chilling and tragic tale, forever etching the name of Albert Fish into the annals of criminal history. The worst news that Police Lieutenant Samuel Dribbin had for the Budd family was that the address given by Frank Howard for his sister's apartment was entirely fictitious. The kindly old man was a fraud. There was no Frank Howard, no farm in Farmingdale, Long Island. None of it was true. The police initiated the usual investigative procedures, meticulously checking every detail provided by this Frank Howard. They had the Budds sift through the rogues' gallery of photos and cross-checked known child molesters, mental patients, and other suspects. It all led to a dead end, and there was no trace of Gracie. On June 7th, the New York police distributed 1,000 flyers to police stations across the country, featuring a photograph of Gracie and a description of Mr. Howard. This activity, coupled with extensive local publicity, spurred an epidemic of Gracie sightings and a flood of crank letters, each one needing thorough investigation by 21+ detectives who were assigned to the case. Despite the numerous false leads, there were a couple of solid clues. The police identified the Western Union office in Manhattan from which Frank Howard had sent his message to the Budds, along with the original handwritten note. The writing and grammar indicated that Howard possessed some level of education and refinement. Additionally, they traced the push cart where Howard had purchased the pot cheese he had given to the Budds. Both locations were in East Harlem, which then became the focal point of intense search and investigation. The investigation had moved into East Harlem, driven by the faint but persistent hope that somewhere in the maze of the city streets and buildings, there may be a clue that would lead to Gracie. The search for the missing girl had become a city-wide effort, and a race against time and fading hope. The New York police were no strangers to child kidnapping. In fact, an eerily similar case had occurred just the year before. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney played in the hallway outside his apartment with his 3-year-old neighbor, also named Billy. A 12-year-old neighbor, who was babysitting his sleeping baby sister, briefly joined the boys but quickly returned to his apartment upon hearing his sister's cry. A few minutes later, the older boy noticed that both Billies were gone and alerted the younger Billy's father. After a frantic search, the father found his 3-year-old son alone on the top floor of the building. The boy had somehow made his way up to the roof. The man asked his son where Billy Gaffney was, and the little boy replied, "The Boogeyman took him." The following day, a platoon of detectives arrived to investigate Billy Gaffney's disappearance, but they dismissed the 3-year-old witness, who steadfastly repeated his simple explanation. Initially, the police suspected that the boy had wandered into one of the nearby buildings, or worse, had fallen into the canal a few blocks away. The community organized a search, and the canal was dredged, but there was no sign of little Billy. The disappearance of Billy Gaffney cast a long shadow over the city, a reminder of the lurking dangers that could snatch a child away in an instant. As the Budd family grappled with their own nightmare, the memory of little Billy Gaffney's case loomed large, underscoring the grim reality that sometimes children vanished without a trace, taken by unseen and unfathomable forces. Eventually, someone heeded the account of the 3-year-old witness, who had described the Boogeyman as a slender old man with grey hair and a grey mustache. The police, however, dismissed the description and failed to connect it to a crime committed by the Great Man a few years earlier. In July of 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonnell played on the front porch of his home in the pastoral Charlton Woods section of Staten Island. His mother sat nearby nursing her infant daughter when she noticed a gaunt elderly gentleman with grey hair and a grey mustache standing in the middle of the street. She watched as the strange, shabby old man, who continually clenched and unclenched his fists while mumbling to himself, tipped his dusty hat to her and then disappeared down the street. Later that same afternoon, the old man was seen again, this time watching Francis and 4 other boys play ball. The old man called Francis over to him, and the other boys continued to play. A few minutes later, both the old man and Francis had vanished. A neighbor saw a boy resembling Francis walking into a wooded area, followed by an elderly, grey-haired tramp. Francis's disappearance went unnoticed until he missed dinner. His father, a policeman, quickly organized a search party. Tragically, they found the boy in the woods, hidden under some branches. The severity of what had happened to this child led police to doubt that the old tramp could be as old and frail as he had appeared. The ferocity suggested that the tramp might have had an accomplice with the strength to commit such a heinous act. The case of Francis McDonnell highlighted the monstrous nature of the Grey Man, an elusive figure whose true identity and motives remained shrouded in darkness. As the Budd family grappled with their own tragedy, the sinister shadow of Albert Fish loomed ever larger, a reminder of the horrors that could lurk behind a seemingly benign facade. In a short period, Manhattan's fingerprint experts, police photographers, and some 250 plainclothesmen were enlisted in the case. The massive manhunt yielded several promising suspects, but none matched the description of the grey-haired, mustached old tramp. His face was indelibly etched into Anna MacDonald's memory. She described how he came in shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself, making queer motions with his hands. I'll never forget those hands. I shuddered when I looked at them. How they opened and shut, opened and shut, opened and shut. I saw him look towards Francis and the others. I saw his thick grey hair, his drooping grey moustache. Everything about him seemed faded and grey. That was Anna's testimony. And despite the massive efforts of the police and the community, the grey man had vanished without a trace. In November 1934, the Budd case officially remained open, though no one expected it to be solved. Only one man, William F. King, continued to pursue the case. Occasionally, King would plant a phony item about a break in the case with the renowned columnist Walter Winchell. On November 2nd, 1934, Winchell took the bait once again. Winchell wrote in his column that he had checked on the Grace Budd mystery. He recapped that she was 8 when she was kidnapped about 6 years ago, and said it was safe to reveal that the Department of Missing Persons would break the case, or that they expected to in 4 weeks. 10 days later, Delia Budd received a letter that, due to her lack of education, she was fortunately unable to read. Her son, Edward, read it instead, and immediately ran out the door to fetch Detective King. The letter was singularly barbarous. The contents of that letter would unveil the true horror behind the disappearance of young Gracie Budd, revealing the monstrous depths of Albert Fishy's depravity. It was a pivotal moment in one of the most chilling manhunts in criminal history. In 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco for Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the poor that young children were often sold for food in order to keep others from starving, a practice that had become so commonplace that shops no longer even bothered to lie about their meat source. John had stayed there for so long that he had acquired a taste for that meat, and on his return to New York, he went to the darkest depths to fulfill that appetite. 2 boys were taken, one 7 and one 11. The acts inflicted to tenderize them are too graphic to be depicted here, but the captain made his meal of them, and this was described in the most horrific detail by the author, who then went on to write that he had been this man's neighbor, and had heard from him so often how good the meat was that he had made up his mind to taste it for himself. Then came the chilling sentence that had no doubt sent Edward so quickly out that door. On Sunday, June 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Gracie sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers, and I won't read the rest, or we would all lose sleep tonight. Suffice to say, it was a brutal end, and his appetite was sated. No one wanted to believe that this letter was true. It had to be the ravings of some perverted, sadistic crank. But Detective King realized that the details of the meeting with the Budds and Grace were accurate. Additionally, the handwriting on this horrific letter matched that of the elderly kidnapper's note written for the Western Union Messenger 6 years earlier. The envelope contained a crucial clue, a small hexagonal emblem with the letters NYPCBA, which stood for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. With the cooperation of the association's president, an emergency meeting of the members was convened. Meanwhile, the police examined the handwritten membership forms, searching for the handwriting similar to Frank Howard's. Detective King then asked the members, all of whom had passed the test, to report anyone who had taken the association's stationery. A young janitor came forward, admitting he had taken a couple of sheets of paper and a few envelopes. He had left the stationery in his old rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street. The landlady was shocked when she was given Frank Howard's description, because he sounded just like the old man who had lived there for 2 months. The old man had checked out of her rooming house just a couple of days earlier, leaving behind a trail of clues that would finally lead to his capture. The diligent work of Detective King and the cooperation of the community had brought them one step closer to unmasking the true identity of the monster known as Albert Fish. The former tenant had called himself Albert H. Fish. The landlady mentioned that Fish had told her to hold a letter he was expecting from his son, who worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps in North Carolina. The son regularly sent money to his old dad. Finally, the post office informed Detective King that it had intercepted a letter for Albert Fish. Detective King was becoming worried that Fish had not contacted his former landlady. The police feared that something had scared him away. On December 13, 1934, the landlady called Detective King. Albert Fish was at the rooming house, looking for his letter. The old man was sitting with a teacup when King opened the door. Fish stood up and nodded when King asked if he was Albert Fish. Suddenly, Fish reached into his pocket and produced a razor blade, holding it in front of him menacingly. Infuriated, King grabbed the old man's hand and twisted it sharply. "I've got you now," he said triumphantly. With the arrest of Albert Fish, the authorities had finally captured the Grey Man, ending a nightmarish chapter in criminal history. The diligent efforts of Detective King and the unwavering pursuit of justice had brought an end to Fish's reign of terror. The confession of Albert Fish would be heard by many law enforcement officials and psychiatrists. A severely edited version of it would appear in the newspapers. It was an odyssey of perversion and unspeakable depravity, which seemed unbelievable until detail after detail was corroborated. It was all the more astonishing considering how decrepit and harmless Fish appeared. He was a stooped, frail-looking old man, about 130 pounds and 5 feet 5 inches tall. Detective King took the initial confession. Fish told him that in the summer of 1928, he had been overcome by what he called his bloodthirst, his need to kill. When he had answered Edward Budd's ad for employment, it was the young man, not his sister, whom he intended to lure to a remote location, restrain and mutilate. After leaving the Budds' house for the first time, Fish had purchased the tools he would need to murder and mutilate the boys: a cleaver, a saw, a butcher knife, and wrapped these implements of destruction into a bundle, which he left at a newsstand before he went to the Budd home for the second and last time. When Fish saw the strapping young Edward the size of a full-grown man and his friend Willie, he doubted his ability to overpower the two of them. But Fish had a lot of experience in that regard. It was only after seeing Gracie that he changed his mind and his plans. It was she he desperately wanted to kill. The confession revealed the depths of Fish's depravity, providing a chilling insight into the mind of a man driven by unspeakable urges. The frail appearance of Fish masked the monstrous reality within, a reality that had brought untold suffering to the Budd family and others. With the unsuspecting Gracie in tow, Fish stopped back at the newsstand to pick up his bundle before taking the train to the Bronx and then to the village of Worthington in Westchester. For Grace, He only bought a one-way ticket. Grace was enthralled with the 40-minute ride into the countryside. Only twice in her life had she ever been out of the city, so this was a wonderful treat for her. They walked along a remote road until they reached an abandoned 2-story building called Wisteria Cottage in the midst of a wooded area. While Grace entertained herself outside with various wildflowers, Fish went up to the second-floor bedroom, opened up his bundle of tools, and took off his clothes. And then he called to Gracie to come upstairs. In her innocence, Gracie had no inkling of the horror that awaited her inside Wisteria Cottage. What began as an innocent adventure into the countryside turned into a nightmare orchestrated by a depraved mind. The tragic end of young Grace Budd marked one of the most harrowing chapters in the annals of criminal history. With the wildflowers she had gathered in a bouquet, Gracie came into the house. This was how the horrific confession began, and when he had finished, the shaken detective asked him one final question. What caused him to do this horrible thing? You know, Fish answered. I never could account for it. And when Captain John Steen asked him why he had written the letter to the Budds, Fish responded that he didn't know why. I just had a mania for writing, he said. That day, the police went to Wisteria Cottage and recovered the remains of Gracie. Albert Fish stood nearby, completely devoid of any emotion. That night at 10 p.m., Fish was interrogated by Assistant District Attorney P. Francis Marrow. When Marrow asked Fish why he had murdered Gracie, he explained that a sort of bloodthirst had overwhelmed him. Once it was done, he was overcome with sorrow. I would have given my life within a half hour after I'd done it to restore it to her. Marrow asked if he had defiled Gracie sexually, and Fish was adamant. It never entered my head. Nothing was asked at that time, nor was anything volunteered about the cannibalism mentioned in Fish's letter to the Budds. The police may have considered it too insane to be true, or perhaps they were already thinking that including horrible details about cannibalism would bolster the inevitable defense case for insanity. That night, news of Albert Fish's capture leaked to the newspapers and reporters descended on the Budd apartment with the story. Shortly afterward, Detective King drove Mr. Budd and his son Edward to the police station to identify Fish. Edward did more than identify Fish. He threw himself at the old man. He was swearing and screaming, but Albert Fish maintained his lack of emotion. Until Mr. Budd asked him, "Don't you know me?" And Fish just answered politely, "Yes, you're Mr. Budd. And you are the man who came to my home as a guest and took my little girl away," was Mr. Budd's only response. The capture of Albert Fish brought a semblance of closure to the Budd family, but the scars left by his monstrous actions would never be healed. The shocking lack of remorse in Fish's demeanor only deepened the horror of his crimes, cementing his place in history as one of the most depraved criminals ever known. Albert Fish, not surprisingly, was no stranger to police. His record stretched back to 1903 when he had been jailed for grand larceny. Since then, he had been arrested 6 times for various petty crimes, such as sending obscene letters and petty thefts. Half of those arrests occurred around the time of Gracie's abduction. Each time, the charges were dismissed. And he had been in mental institutions more than once. When asked about his background, Albert Fish described how he was born May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. His father was Captain Randall Fish, a 32nd-degree Mason, and he is buried in the Grand Lodge grounds of the Congressional Cemetery. He was a Potomac River boat captain, running from D.C. to Marshall Hall, Virginia. Fish's father dropped dead October 15, 1875, in the old Pennsylvania station where President Garfield was shot, and Fish was placed in St. John's Orphanage in Washington. He was there until he was nearly 9, and that's where things went wrong. They were unmercifully whipped there, and saw boys doing many things they should not have done. He sang in the choir from 1880 to 1884, soprano at St. John's. He came to New York and was a good painter, interiors or anything. He got an apartment and brought his mother up from Washington, and that's when he met his wife. But after their 6 children were born, she left him, took all the furniture and didn't even leave a mattress for the children to sleep on. He sniffled then, claiming to be worried about his children, though his children ranged from age 21 to 35. He lamented that they had not come to visit their old dad in jail. Albert Fishy's criminal history and tragic personal background painted a complex picture of a man shaped by early traumas and marked by a lifetime of petty crimes and institutionalization. Yet nothing in his past could account for the depths of his depravity, nor the monstrous acts he committed later in life. Albert Fish was facing indictments in Manhattan and Westchester County, Westchester. Westchester County indicted him on a charge of first-degree murder, while Manhattan was preparing an indictment for kidnapping. Meanwhile, the police got a significant break. The motorman on the Brooklyn trolley line saw a picture of Fish in the newspaper and came forward to identify Fish as the nervous old man he saw on February 11, 1927, trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him on the trolley. Joseph Meehan, the retired motorman, watched the two carefully. The little boy, who didn't have a jacket or coat, was crying for his mother continuously and had to be dragged by the old man on and off the trolley. The little boy, as it turned out, was the kidnapped Billy Gaffney. Ultimately, Fish did confess to the unspeakable things he did to Billy Gaffney. The horrific confession of Albert Fish to the murder and mutilation of Billy Gaffney added another layer of depravity to his already monstrous legacy. The detailed account of his unspeakable acts left the most hardened detectives reeling. This case cemented Fishy's place in history as one of the most horrifying criminals ever known. Fish was also tied to the 1932 murder of a 15-year-old girl named Mary O'Connor in Far Rockaway. The girl's mauled remains were found in some woods close to a house that Fish had been painting. With all those indictments in different places, there was very little chance that Albert Fish was going to be acquitted. His only opportunity to avoid the death penalty was to have the alienists or forensic psychiatrists declare him insane. Albert Fishy's horrific confessions and the mounting evidence against him painted a clear picture of a man driven by unimaginable urges. The multiple indictments across counties made it nearly impossible for him to escape justice. His only hope lay in convincing the courts of his insanity, a desperate attempt to evade the ultimate punishment for his unspeakable crimes. Dr. Frederick Witham, in his book The Show of Violence, describes his first meeting with Albert Fish in his jail cells. He was shocked at how meek, gentle, benevolent, and polite Fish appeared. If you wanted someone to entrust your children to, he would be the one you would choose. Fishy's attitude towards his situation was one of complete detachment. I have no particular desire to live. I have no particular desire to be killed. It is a matter of indifference to me. I do not think I am altogether right. When Dr. Witham asked if he meant that he was insane, Fish answered, "Not exactly. I never could understand myself." Psychosis seemed to have galloped through Fishy's family history from what Dr. Witham could ascertain. One paternal uncle suffered from religious psychosis and died in a state hospital. A half-brother also died in a state hospital. A younger brother was feeble-minded and died of hydrocephalus. His mother was held to be very queer and was said to hear and see things. A paternal aunt was considered completely crazy, a brother suffered from chronic alcoholism, and a sister had some sort of mental affliction. Fish claimed that his real name was Hamilton Fish, named after a distant relative who was President Grant's Secretary of State. Tired of being teased about that name, he took the name Albert instead. When he was 26, he married a young woman of 19 and had 6 children. When the youngest was 3, She ran off with another man, leaving Fish to raise the children. Subsequently, he married 3 other times, although they were not legal since he had never been divorced from his first wife. Albert Fish's seemingly benign demeanor contrasted starkly with the horrific nature of his crimes. His complex and tragic family history of mental illness provided some context but no justification for his monstrous acts. As the alienists delved deeper into his psyche, they grappled with understanding the man behind the atrocities, a task as daunting as it was essential. Dr. Wortham considered Fish's unparalleled perversity unique in the annals of psychiatric and criminal literature. Sadomasochism directed against children, particularly boys, took the lead in his sexually regressive development. Fish told him, "I always had a desire to inflict pain on others and to have others inflict pain on me. I always seemed to enjoy everything that hurt." Fish confided in Dr. Wortham a long history of preying on children, at least 100. Fish would bribe them with money or candy. He usually chose African American children because he believed that the police did not pay much attention when they were hurt or missing. He never went back to the same neighborhood. He said he had lived in at least 23 states, and in each one he had killed at least 1 child. Sometimes he lost his job as a painter because he was suspiciously connected to these dead or mutilated youngsters. Fish also had the compulsion to write obscene letters and did so frequently. According to Dr. Wortham, they were not the typical obscene letters based on fantasies and daydreams to supply a vicarious thrill. They were offers to practice his inclinations with the people he wrote his graphic suggestions to. Albert Fish's confession to Dr. Wortham revealed the depths of his sadistic nature. His pleasure in inflicting pain and his relentless preying on vulnerable children painted a portrait of pure evil. His compulsive need to document and share his horrific desires only added to the chilling narrative of a man driven by unimaginable urges. Initially, Dr. Wortham had concerns about whether Fish was lying to him, especially when he told him the graphic details of the ways in which he indulged in his desire for pain. Around the age of 55, Fish started to experience hallucinations and delusions. He had visions of Christ and his angels, and he began to be engrossed in religious speculations about purging himself of iniquities and sins, atonement by physical suffering and self-torture. Fish believed that God had ordered him to torment and commit despicable acts. The revelations from Albert Fish's confessions were both shocking and horrifying. The discovery of needles embedded in his body confirmed his self-torturous practices, while his delusions and hallucinations revealed a mind completely consumed by madness. Dr. Wortham's assessment of Fish painted a picture of a man far beyond the borders of sanity, driven by a terrifying combination of religious fanaticism and sadistic pleasure. That Fish was suffering from some religious psychosis was a given as far as Dr. Wortham was concerned. Fish's own children had seen him hitting himself on his nude body with a nail-studded paddle until he was covered with blood. They also saw him stand alone on a hill with his hands raised, shouting, "I am Christ." Dr. Wortham, the defense alienist, believed that Fish was legally insane. I characterized his personality as introverted and extremely infantilistic. I outlined his abnormal mental makeup and his mental disease, which I diagnosed as paranoid psychosis, because Fish suffered from delusions, and particularly was so mixed up about the questions of punishment, sin, atonement, religion, torture, self-punishment, that he had a perverted and distorted, and, if you want, an insane knowledge of right and wrong. His test was that if it had been wrong, he would have been stopped, as Abraham was stopped by an angel. Defense alienists testified that Fish was insane. The 4 alienists called by the prosecution testified that Fish was sane. One of those prosecution alienists was the head of the psychiatric hospital where Fish had been detained for observation for a couple of years after the Budd and other murders where he had been judged both harmless and sane. The trial of Albert Fish became a battleground of psychiatric evaluations. with experts divided on whether he was legally sane. Dr. Wortham's detailed diagnosis painted a picture of a man driven by delusions and a distorted sense of morality. However, the prosecution's experts countered with their assessment of Fish's sanity. The conflicting testimonies highlighted the complexities of understanding the true nature of Fish's mind. The trial of Albert Fish for the premeditated murder of Grace Budd began on Monday, March 11, 1935, in White Plains, New York. Justice Frederick P. Close presided. Chief Assistant District Attorney Albert E. Gallagher was in charge of the prosecution, and James Dempsey served as the defense attorney. Defense Attorney Dempsey planned to attack the competence of the Bellevue Hospital alienist who had observed Fish in 1930 and declared him sane. He also intended to establish that Fish was suffering from lead colic, a dementia often suffered by house painters. Gallagher's key strategy was summarized early in the trial. Now, in this case, there is a presumption of sanity. The proof, briefly, will be that this defendant is legally sane and that he knows the difference between right and wrong and the nature and quality of his acts, that he is not defective mentally, and that he had a wonderful memory for a man of his age, that he has complete orientation as to his immediate surroundings, that there is no mental deterioration, but that he is sexually abnormal, that he is known medically as a sex pervert or a sex psychopath, and his acts were abnormal, but that he took this girl from her home on the 3rd day of June 1928, and in doing that act, and in procuring the tools with which he killed her, he knew it was wrong to do that, and that he is legally sane and should answer for these acts. Defense Attorney Dempsey focused on Fish's strange life and the self-flagellation with nail-studded paddles and needles. Then he highlighted Fish's competence as a father and his love for his children. In spite of all these brutal, criminal and vicious proclivities, there is another side to this defendant. He has been a very fine father. He never once in his life laid a hand on one of his children. He says grace at every meal in his house. In 1917, when the youngest of his 6 children was 3, his wife left him, and from that time, down until shortly before the Grace Budd murder in 1928, he was a mother and a father to those children. The trial of Albert Fish brought to light the depths of his depravity and the complexities of his mental state. The prosecution argued for his sanity and culpability, while the defense painted a picture of a man driven by profound mental illness and delusions. The courtroom became a battleground of moral and legal arguments, each side striving to define the boundaries of sanity and responsibility. Gracie's parents and brother Albert Jr. testified. Defense Attorney Dempsey seemed determined to make the point that both Della and Albert Sr. gave their consent to Grace going to a birthday party with Fish. When it came time for Gracie's father to testify, he was so overcome with emotion he began to weep loudly. On the 3rd day of trial, over the strenuous objections of the defense attorney, a box of Grace Budd's remains was brought into the courtroom as evidence, while Detective King recreated Fish's confession on what had happened that day. Then Gallagher reached into the box and held out a small skull. It was a very dramatic moment. Dempsey sought a mistrial. Dempsey focused on the cannibalism issue as a central part of the insanity defense. It was clear that he was trying to establish that Fish had indulged in this practice, something that no sane person would do. But he was unsuccessful in establishing and proving that Fish actually did what he said he did. Fish appeared completely indifferent throughout the trial, although at one point he expressed to his attorney that he had a desire to live because God still has work for me to do. Dempsey put several of Fish's children on the stand to testify to his bizarre behavior, self-flagellation and sticking needles in his body, as well as religious delusions. They also testified he was a good father who always provided for them and never physically abused them. The testimonies in the trial of Albert Fish painted a complex and disturbing picture. The grief of Grace Budd's family was palpable, and the dramatic presentation of evidence left a deep impression on all present. The defense's focus on Fish's cannibalism and bizarre behavior aimed to establish his insanity, while the prosecution sought to prove his sanity and culpability. Through it all, Fish remained detached, a chilling figure whose actions and motivations were scrutinized in the harsh light of the courtroom. Eventually, Dempsey had a chance to attack the prosecution alienist Dr. Charles Lambert. After a 3-hour interview with Fish, he pronounced him a psychopathic personality without a psychosis. Dempsey asked Lambert, "Assume that this man not only killed this girl, but indulged in cannibalism. Will you state that a man could, for 9 days, eat remains and still not have a psychosis?" Lambert answered, "Well, there is no accounting for taste, Mr. Dempsey." Dempsey persisted, "Tell me, how many cases in your experience have you seen people who actually ate human feces?" "I know individuals prominent in society, one in particular that we all know, who used it as a side dish in his salad," Lambert remarked casually. Dempsey had better luck with one of the other defense alienists who could see signs of psychosis in Fish's behavior. The courtroom exchange highlights the stark difference in expert opinions regarding Albert Fish's mental state. Dr. Charles Lambert's dismissive responses to Dempsey's probing questions underscored the challenge of defining insanity in the context of such extreme behavior. However, the testimony of another defense alienist recognizing signs of psychosis in Fish's actions added weight to the argument that Fish was driven by profound mental illness. The trial lasted 10 days, and the jury took less than an hour to reach its verdict. "We find the defendant guilty as charged," the foreman said. Fish was not happy with the verdict, but the prospect of being electrocuted had its appeal to him. A Daily News reporter wrote, "His watery eyes gleamed at the thought of being burned by a heat more intense than the flames with which he often seared his flesh to gratify his lust." And Fish thanked the judge for his sentence of death by electrocution. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed. The swift conclusion of Albert Fish's trial and his subsequent execution marked the end of one of the most disturbing chapters in criminal history. The jury's quick decision and Fish's unsettling reaction to his sentence underscored the profound horror of his crimes. In the end, the man who had inflicted so much pain met his fate in the electric chair, leaving behind a legacy of terror and a dark reminder of the depths of humanity.